The dust had turned to mud beneath Kiera Olsen's boots, and somewhere between the dawn prayer she'd whispered and the midday sun that now beat down mercilessly, she'd lost all hope of reaching Lordsburg, New Mexico, before nightfall. She stood beside her wagon, tears streaming down her sun-flushed cheeks, staring at the shattered remains of the rear wheel that had carried her possessions, her dreams, and her determination across 400 miles of unforgiving territory. The wheel had splintered apart so completely that several spokes jutted out at impossible angles, and the iron rim had twisted off entirely, lying in the dirt like a discarded hoop from a child's game. Kiera pressed the heel of her hand against her eyes, trying to stop the tears, but they came anyway, hot and shameful. She was 22 years old, alone on a trail 3 miles outside of town, and absolutely certain this was the end of everything she'd worked toward. Her father had died 6 months ago in Chicago, leaving her with debts she couldn't pay and a boarding house she couldn't manage alone. The letter from her aunt in Lordsburg had arrived like Providence itself, offering her a fresh start, a partnership in a successful dress shop, and a chance to build something of her own in the growing railroad town. She'd sold everything, packed what remained, and set out with a wagon train that had disbanded 2 days ago when most of the families decided to push north toward Santa Fe instead. Now here she stood, utterly alone, with a broken wagon and no earthly idea how to fix it. The sound of hoofbeats made her spin around, one hand instinctively reaching for the rifle propped against the wagon seat. A man approached on a roan horse, sitting easy in the saddle with the kind of confidence that came from years of hard living. He was tall, she could tell even from a distance, with broad shoulders beneath a dusty brown shirt and a hat pulled low against the sun. Kiera wiped at her face quickly, straightening her spine despite the exhaustion that made her bones ache. The man drew closer, and she could make out more details now. A strong jaw shadowed with several days' worth of beard, eyes that were a striking shade of green even beneath the brim of his hat, and an expression that managed to be both cautious and concerned. "Madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat as he reined his horse to a stop about 10 feet away. "Looks like you've got some trouble." His voice was deep and measured, with a slight drawl that suggested Texas origins. Kiera's throat felt tight, but she forced herself to speak. "The wheel broke. I was trying to make it to Lordsburg before dark." The man dismounted in one fluid motion, and she noticed he moved with a slight favor to his left leg, as though an old injury still bothered him. He was younger than she'd first thought, maybe 26 or 27, with the kind of weathered face that came from living outdoors more than in. "May I take a look?" he asked, and there was something gentle in his tone that made fresh tears prick at Kiera's eyes. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and stepped aside as he crouched down to examine the broken wheel. He let out a low whistle, running his fingers along the shattered spokes with the careful attention of someone who understood such things. "This didn't just break," he said after a moment. "The wood was already weak, probably dry rot. You're lucky it gave out here instead of on one of the canyon passes." "Lucky," Kiera repeated, and a half-hysterical laugh escaped her. "I'm stranded in the middle of nowhere with everything I own, and you say I'm lucky." The man looked up at her, and his green eyes were kind. "You're alive, aren't you? And you're only 3 miles from town. That's luckier than a lot of folks get out here." He stood, dusting off his hands on his worn trousers, and extended one toward her. "Ethan Xavier. I work the cattle ranges south of here, heading into Lordsburg for supplies." Kiera hesitated only a moment before taking his hand. His grip was firm and warm, calloused from hard work. "Kiera Olsen. I'm supposed to be meeting my aunt in Lordsburg, but at this rate, I'll be lucky to get there by Christmas." "It's July," Ethan said, and there was a hint of amusement in his voice. "I reckon we can do better than that." He walked around the wagon, examining it from every angle, occasionally stopping to test the other wheels or peer underneath the bed. Kiera watched him, trying not to notice the capable way his hands moved or how his shoulders strained against his shirt when he lifted himself up to check the wagon's undercarriage. "You've got good news and bad news," Ethan said finally, straightening up. "The bad news is this wheel is beyond repair. The good news is I've got tools and timber back at my place, about 2 miles that way." He pointed southwest, toward a line of low hills. "I can fashion you a new wheel, get you back on the road by tomorrow afternoon." Kiera's heart lurched. "I can't pay you. I mean, I have some money, but I need it for when I get to Lordsburg to help my aunt with the shop." Ethan shook his head. "Didn't ask for payment. Can't leave a lady stranded out here. Wouldn't be right." Something in Kiera's chest loosened, a knot she hadn't even realized had formed. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" He met her eyes, and there was something in his expression she couldn't quite read. "My mother used to say that strangers are just friends you haven't met yet. Besides, out here we help each other or we don't survive. It's that simple." Kiera wanted to argue, wanted to insist on paying him something, but the relief was too overwhelming. "Thank you," she managed, her voice breaking. "Thank you so much." Ethan nodded once, businesslike now. "We need to get this wagon off the trail proper, unhitch your horse and get you situated. I'll ride back to my place, get what I need, and come back before sundown. You got food and water?" "Yes, enough for several days." "Good. I'll build you a fire before I go, make sure you're set up proper. There's no rain in those clouds, despite how they look, so you'll be fine out here for the night." He moved with swift efficiency, guiding her wagon to a flat clearing 20 yards off the main trail, near a cluster of juniper trees that would provide some shade. Kiera's horse, a gentle mare named Daisy that she'd bought in Kansas City, seemed to sense the change in circumstances and stood quietly as Ethan unhitched her, checking her hooves and running a practiced hand down her legs. "She's a good animal," he said approvingly. "Well cared for." "She's been the best companion I could ask for," Kiera admitted, stroking Daisy's nose. "Better than most people I've known." Ethan glanced at her, curiosity flickering across his face, but he didn't pry. Instead, he gathered deadwood and dried brush, building a fire ring with stones and showing Kiera how to bank it, so it would burn slowly through the night without consuming too much fuel. The sun was starting its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, when Ethan finally swung back up onto his horse. "I'll be back before dark," he promised. "Don't let that fire go out and keep your rifle close. Coyotes might come sniffing around, but they are more afraid of you than you are of them. Just make noise if they get too bold." Kiera nodded, trying to look braver than she felt. "I'll be fine." Ethan studied her for a long moment, and Kiera had the distinct impression he could see right through her false confidence. But he didn't challenge her, just touched his hat brim again and wheeled his horse around, cantering off toward those distant hills. As the sound of hoofbeats faded, Kiera sank down onto a crate beside the fire, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had kept her upright was draining away, leaving her shaky and uncertain. She'd been so focused on getting to Lordsburg, on starting her new life, that she hadn't let herself think too much about the journey itself. Now, sitting alone in the vast emptiness of the New Mexico territory, she felt small and vulnerable in a way she'd never experienced back in Chicago. But there was also something else, something she hadn't expected. When Ethan Xavier had smiled at her, really smiled, not the polite grimace men usually offered but a genuine expression of warmth, She'd felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear or exhaustion. It was attraction, pure and simple, and it had caught her completely off guard. Kiera shook her head, trying to clear it. The last thing she needed was to develop feelings for some cowboy she'd just met, no matter how kind his eyes or how capable his hands. She was going to Lordsburg to build a business, to create independence and security. Romance, if it came at all, would have to wait. True to his word, Ethan returned just as the sun was touching the horizon. This time, he was leading a pack horse loaded with tools, timber, and what looked like supplies. He dismounted and began unloading, moving with the same efficient grace Kiera had noticed earlier. "Brought you some extra food," he said, pulling out a cloth-wrapped package. "Fresh bread from this morning, some dried beef, and a few apples. Figured you might appreciate a change from trail rations." Kiera's stomach growled audibly, and she felt her cheeks flush. "You didn't have to do that." "Wanted to," Ethan replied simply. He laid out the timber pieces, examining them in the fading light, then nodded to himself. "I'll get started on this at first light. Should take most of the day to shape the spokes, fit the rim, and make sure everything's solid. Can't rush this kind of work. Where will you sleep?" Kiera asked, suddenly aware of the impropriety of the situation. A single woman alone with a man she'd just met, miles from anywhere. Ethan seemed to read her thoughts. "I'll bed down on the other side of the fire, give you privacy. I'm a sound sleeper, won't bother you none. If it makes you feel better, I can sleep further out, but I'd rather be close in case there's trouble." Kiera considered this. Everything about Ethan suggested he was trustworthy, from the gentle way he'd handled her horse to the respect in his tone when he spoke to her. And truthfully, the idea of having someone nearby, someone capable and calm, made the prospect of spending the night out here much less terrifying. "The other side of the fire is fine," she said. "Thank you again for all of this." "No thanks needed," Ethan said, but he smiled, and Kiera felt that flutter again. They ate in companionable silence as the stars began to appear overhead, more stars than Kiera had ever seen in her life. The bread was indeed fresh, still soft in the middle with a perfectly crusty exterior, and the dried beef was seasoned with something that made it more flavorful than any she'd had on the trail. "Did you make this bread?" she asked, unable to help her curiosity. Ethan nodded. "Learned from my mother. She died when I was 17, but she made sure I knew how to take care of myself first. Cooking, mending, all of it. Said a man who couldn't take care of his basic needs wasn't much of a man at all." "She sounds like she was wise," Kiera said softly. "She was." Ethan's voice carried a note of old grief, the kind that had dulled with time but never quite disappeared. "My father died when I was 12, cattle stampede. She raised me and my two sisters on her own after that. They're both married now, living in Texas with families of their own." "Do you miss them?" "Every day," Ethan admitted. "But New Mexico suited me better than Texas ever did. Too many memories there, too many ghosts. Out here I can breathe." Kiera understood that more than she wanted to admit. Chicago had become suffocating after her father's death. Every street corner a reminder of what she'd lost. Every familiar face a source of pity she couldn't bear. The West had called to her not just as an opportunity, but as an escape. "My father died 6 months ago," she found herself saying. "He was a banker, very proper, very concerned with reputation. When he died, I discovered the debts he'd hidden, the money he'd lost trying to maintain appearances. I had to sell our house, the boarding house we owned, everything. Coming west was my only option." "I'm sorry," Ethan said, and the simple sincerity in his words made Kiera's eyes burn with tears again. "He wasn't a bad man," she continued, needing suddenly to defend him. "Just proud. Too proud to admit he needed help, too proud to scale back when he should have. And now he's gone and I'm here, and sometimes I'm so angry with him I can hardly breathe. Ethan was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. Grief and anger walk hand in hand, he said finally. My mother taught me that too. Said it was natural to be angry at the people we love when they leave us, even if it wasn't their choice. The anger fades eventually, and what's left is just the love and the missing. Something about the way he said it, so matter-of-fact and yet so understanding, made Kiera feel less alone than she had in months. How long did it take? For your anger to fade? Couple years, maybe. But everyone's different. You can't rush grief, can't force it into a timeline that makes sense. You just have to live through it. They sat in silence after that, but it was a comfortable quiet, the kind that didn't need filling. Kiera found herself studying Ethan in the firelight, noticing the small details she'd missed earlier. The scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the strong line of his jaw, the way his hands rested loosely on his knees, relaxed and capable at once. When the fire had burned down to glowing coals, Ethan stood and stretched. Best get some sleep. Dawn comes early, and I want to have that wheel finished by tomorrow evening. Can I help? Kiera asked. I'm not skilled with carpentry, but I can follow instructions. Ethan looked surprised, then pleased. I'd appreciate the company, and an extra pair of hands is always useful. We'll make a good team. The way he said it, simple and assured, made warmth spread through Kiera's chest. Good night, Ethan. Good night, Kiera. She settled into her bedroll inside the wagon, leaving the canvas sides rolled up so she could see the fire, and beyond it, Ethan's form as he arranged his own sleeping gear. She felt safer than she had any right to, given the circumstances, and when sleep finally claimed her, it was deep and dreamless. Kiera woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of a saw biting through wood. She sat up, disoriented for a moment, then remembered where she was and why. Through the open wagon side, she could see Ethan already hard at work, the timber pieces laid out in an organized fashion around him. The sun was barely above the horizon, painting everything in soft gold light. She climbed out of the wagon, running her fingers through her tangled hair and wishing she had time for a proper wash. Instead, she settled for splashing some water on her face from her canteen and changing her dusty blouse for a slightly less dusty one. Morning, Ethan called, not looking up from his work. Coffee's hot and there's more bread if you're hungry. You're up early, Kiera observed, pouring herself a cup of coffee from the pot he'd set up near the fire. Habit, Ethan replied. Cattle don't care if you're tired. They need tending at dawn whether you like it or not. Kiera watched him work as she sipped her coffee, fascinated by the precision of his movements. He measured twice, cut once, and checked each spoke for straightness before setting it aside. There was something almost meditative about it, the way he focused entirely on the task at hand. What do you need me to do? She asked, setting down her empty cup. Ethan glanced up, and his smile was warm in the morning light. See those spokes I've already cut? I need them sanded smooth. There's sandpaper in that toolbox. Just work in long, even strokes, following the grain of the wood. It was satisfying work, Kiera discovered. There was something deeply gratifying about taking a rough piece of wood and transforming it into something smooth and finished. They worked in comfortable silence, broken occasionally by Ethan's instructions or Kiera's questions about the process. As the sun climbed higher, the heat became oppressive. Ethan stripped off his shirt, working in just his undershirt, and Kiera tried very hard not to notice the play of muscles in his arms or the way sweat made his skin gleam. She wasn't entirely successful. You're good at this, Ethan commented during a brief water break. taking direction, staying focused. A lot of people can't handle detailed work like this. I helped my father with bookkeeping, Kiera explained. Numbers require the same kind of attention to detail. If you're careless, everything falls apart. True enough, Ethan agreed. He studied her for a moment, something thoughtful in his expression. What kind of shop is your aunt opening in Lordsburg? It's a dress shop, but not just for fancy ladies. She wants to make practical clothing for working women, things that are well made and affordable. She learned to sew from her mother, who was a seamstress in Boston, and she's been planning this shop for years. That's smart, Ethan said. Lordsburg's growing fast with the railroad. Lots of families moving in, lots of women who need good clothes that can stand up to frontier life. That's what we're hoping. I'll be handling the business side while she manages the sewing. Between us, we think we can build something lasting. Ethan nodded approvingly. Sounds like you've got a solid plan. That's more than most people come west with. They returned to work, and as the hours passed, Kiera found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't since leaving Chicago. There was something peaceful about this, about the simple rhythm of work and conversation, about the competence Ethan brought to everything he did. By mid-afternoon, all the spokes were cut and sanded, and Ethan began the delicate process of fitting them into the wheel hub. This required absolute precision, and Kiera watched, handing him tools when he asked and holding pieces steady when needed. Their hands brushed occasionally, and each time Kiera felt that now familiar flutter. "Tell me about your ranch," she said, partly to distract herself from his proximity. "Do you run it alone?" "Mostly," Ethan replied, carefully tapping a spoke into place. "I've got 160 acres, about 50 head of cattle. It's not big, but it's mine. Bought it 3 years ago with money I saved from working other people's ranches. Built the house and barn myself, one board at a time." There was pride in his voice, and rightly so. Kiera knew enough about frontier life to understand what an accomplishment that was. That must have been hard work. "Hardest thing I've ever done," Ethan admitted, "but also the most satisfying. When you build something with your own hands, it means more somehow. You know every nail, every board, every mistake and triumph that went into it." "I hope I feel that way about the shop," Kiera said softly. "I want to build something that matters, something that lasts." Ethan looked up at her, and the intensity in his green eyes made her breath catch. "You will," he said with absolute certainty. "I can tell you're the kind of person who finishes what she starts." The wheel took shape slowly but surely. By late afternoon, Ethan was fitting the iron rim, heating it in the fire until it glowed red, then hammering it into place while Kiera poured water to cool and shrink it tight. The hiss of steam filled the air, and when it cleared, the wheel stood perfect and whole, as sturdy as anything a professional wheelwright might have made. "It's beautiful," Kiera breathed, running her hand along the smooth spokes. "It'll hold," Ethan said, satisfaction evident in his voice. "Should get you to Lordsburg and beyond without trouble." They fitted the wheel onto the wagon, and Ethan insisted on checking every other component, tightening bolts, greasing the axles, making sure everything was in good working order. The sun was setting by the time he declared the wagon road worthy. "You could make it to Lordsburg before full dark," Ethan said, wiping his hands on a rag. "The road's good from here, and there's enough light left." Kiera felt a sudden, unexpected reluctance to leave. These 2 days with Ethan had been strange and unexpected, but also the most peaceful she'd experienced since her father's death. The thought of saying goodbye, of never seeing him again, created a hollow feeling in her chest. "I should go," she said, but she didn't move. "My aunt will be worried." Ethan nodded, but he didn't look happy about it. "Before you do, I want to ask you something." "What is it?" He seemed to struggle with the words, his usual confidence deserting him. "Would you mind if I rode into Lordsburg with you? I need those supplies anyway, and I'd feel better knowing you made it there safe." Relief flooded through Kiera. "I'd like that," she admitted. "I'd like that very much." The smile that broke across Ethan's face was like sunrise, transforming his weathered features into something almost boyish. "Good. Let me pack up my gear and we'll get moving." The ride to Lordsburg took just under an hour, the wagon rolling smoothly on its new wheel. Ethan rode alongside, pointing out landmarks and telling stories about the area. He had a gift for storytelling, Kiera discovered, with a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh despite her nervousness about arriving. Lordsburg appeared as the last light was fading from the sky, a scatter of buildings and lights that grew more defined as they approached. It was bigger than Kiera had expected, a real town with streets and storefronts and the distant whistle of a train. "Where's your aunt's shop?" Ethan asked as they navigated the main street. She said it's on Railroad Avenue near the station. The building has a blue door. They found it easily enough, a narrow building squeezed between a dry goods store and a restaurant. Light glowed in the upstairs windows, and before Kiera could even set the wagon brake, the blue door flew open and a woman came rushing out. "Kiera." "Oh, thank God, I was so worried." Kiera's Aunt Martha was 53 years old, with iron gray hair and her late sister's blue eyes. She pulled Kiera into a fierce embrace the moment she climbed down from the wagon, and Kiera felt tears sting her eyes at the warmth of it. "I'm sorry I'm late," she managed. "I had trouble on the road." Martha pulled back, holding Kiera at arm's length to study her. "You're here now, that's what matters. But who's this?" She'd noticed Ethan, who had dismounted and was hanging back politely. Kiera made introductions, explaining how he'd found her stranded and fixed her wheel. Martha's shrewd eyes moved between them, and Kiera saw understanding dawn there. "Mr. Xavier, you must stay for dinner. It's the least I can offer after your kindness to my niece." Ethan started to protest, but Martha was already herding them inside, talking a mile a minute about the shop, the apartment upstairs, the plans she had for the business. Kiera caught Ethan's eye and saw amusement there, mixed with something that might have been relief. The apartment above the shop was small but comfortable, and Martha had laid out a feast in anticipation of Kiera's arrival. There was roast chicken, fresh vegetables, and a pie that filled the space with the scent of cinnamon and apples. They ate at a small table by the window, and Kiera found herself relaxing completely for the first time in months. Martha was full of questions about Kiera's journey, but she directed just as many at Ethan, asking about his ranch and his plans with the kind of directness that might have been off-putting if it weren't so clearly well-intentioned. Ethan answered easily, and Kiera noticed how he drew Martha out in turn, asking about the shop and the town with genuine interest. After dinner, Martha shooed them both toward the small sitting area while she cleared the dishes. "You two young people relax. Kiera, show Mr. Xavier the sketches for the shop." It was an obvious ploy to give them time alone, but Kiera found she didn't mind. She pulled out the portfolio of drawings Martha had sent, spreading them on the low table between the two chairs. Ethan leaned in to study them, and Kiera was very aware of how close he was, close enough that she could smell the faint scent of leather and sage that clung to him. "These are good," Ethan said, pointing to a design for a split riding skirt. "Practical and well thought out. Women around here will appreciate clothing that lets them move freely." "That's the goal," Kiera agreed. "Too much of women's fashion is designed by men who have never had to actually work in a dress. We want to change that." Ethan looked at her, and there was something in his expression that made her pulse quicken. "I admire that, Not many people have the courage to try something new, to build something different. You did it with your ranch, Kiera pointed out. That's different. Building a ranch is expected for men out here. What you're doing, a woman running a business on her own terms, that takes real grit. The pride in his voice warmed Kiera more than any compliment she'd ever received. They talked for another hour, their conversation ranging from business to books to the challenges and rewards of frontier life. Martha eventually joined them, and the three of them sat together in comfortable companionship until Ethan finally stood to leave. "I should head back," he said reluctantly. "It's a long ride, and my cattle need tending in the morning." Kiera walked him downstairs and out to where his horses waited. The street was quiet now, most of Lordsburg already asleep. Ethan gathered his reins, then paused, seeming to struggle with something. "Kiera, I know you just got here and you've got a lot to settle into, but I was wondering if I might call on you. Not right away, but maybe in a week or two once you're established." Kiera's heart leaped. "I'd like that," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'd like that very much." The smile he gave her was worth more than gold. "Good. I'll come by in 2 weeks then, if that suits you. Maybe you'd let me take you to dinner at that restaurant next door." "That sounds lovely." Ethan seemed reluctant to leave, and Kiera didn't want him to go, but the hour was late and propriety demanded they part. He reached out and took her hand, not shaking it formally but holding it gently between both of his. "Thank you for trusting me," he said softly, "for letting me help you." "Thank you for helping," Kiera replied. "For everything. I don't know what I would have done without you. You'd have figured something out. You're stronger than you think." He released her hand slowly, mounted his horse, and with one last lingering look, rode off into the darkness. Kiera stood watching until she couldn't see him anymore, one hand pressed against her chest where her heart was beating far too fast. When she returned upstairs, Martha was waiting with a knowing smile and 2 cups of tea. "That's a good man," she said without preamble. "I barely know him," Kiera protested, but she was smiling. "Some things you know right away," Martha replied wisely. "I knew your uncle was the one for me within an hour of meeting him. We had 40 good years together before the fever took him. Don't waste time questioning something that feels right." Kiera sat down, wrapping her hands around the warm teacup. "He's coming back in 2 weeks." "Of course he is," Martha said. "Now let's talk about the shop. We've got a lot of work ahead of us if we want to open by September." The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity. Kiera threw herself into preparations for the shop, grateful for the distraction. She and Martha worked from dawn until well past dark, organizing inventory, setting up the storefront, and making connections with potential customers. Lordsburg was indeed growing, with new families arriving on nearly every train, and word of the shop spread quickly. But no matter how busy Kiera kept herself, she thought about Ethan constantly. She replayed their conversations in her mind, remembered the way he'd looked at her, the gentleness of his hands and the kindness in his eyes. She wondered if he was thinking about her too, or if she'd been just a brief interruption in his normal routine. On the 14th day, Kiera woke with butterflies in her stomach. She took extra care with her appearance, choosing a blue calico dress that brought out the color of her eyes and pinning her dark hair up in a style that was practical but flattering. Martha noticed, of course, and said nothing, just smiled secretively while they worked. Ethan arrived at precisely 5 o'clock, looking freshly washed and wearing what was clearly his best shirt. His hat was brushed clean, his boots polished, and he carried a small bouquet of wildflowers that must have taken him hours to gather. "For you," he said, handing them to Kiera with an endearing mix of confidence and nervousness. "I wasn't sure if you liked flowers, but I figured I couldn't go wrong with these." "They're beautiful," Kiera said, meaning it. The bouquet was a riot of colors, Indian paintbrush and lupines and others she didn't recognize. Thank you. Dinner at the restaurant next door was a revelation. The food was excellent, but more than that, being with Ethan felt natural and right in a way Kiera had never experienced. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories and laughter, and the hours flew by without notice. Over the weeks and months that followed, Ethan became a regular fixture in Kiera's life. He came to town every Sunday without fail, and they fell into a comfortable routine of church in the morning, dinner in the afternoon, and long walks in the evening when the heat of the day had passed. Sometimes Martha joined them. Sometimes she made herself scarce with transparent excuses that made both Kiera and Ethan laugh. The dress shop opened in September to considerable success. Women came from Lordsburg and the surrounding ranches, delighted to find practical, well-made clothing at reasonable prices. Kiera's head for business and Martha's skill with a needle proved to be a powerful combination, and within months, they were hiring 2 seamstresses to help keep up with demand. Ethan was there for the grand opening, standing proudly in the back of the crowded shop, and that night he told Kiera how impressed he was with what she and Martha had built. "You were right," he said as they walked along the quiet street. "You are building something that lasts." By November, their courtship had grown serious. Ethan proposed on a cool evening in late fall, taking Kiera out to his ranch for the first time and showing her everything he'd built. The house was simple but sturdy, with beautiful views of the surrounding hills. The barn was well maintained, the cattle healthy and thriving. "I know it's not much compared to what you probably had in Chicago," Ethan said as they stood on the porch watching the sunset. "But it's honest work, and there's room to grow. I've been thinking about expanding, maybe getting into horse breeding along with the cattle." "It's perfect," Kiera said, and she meant it. She'd realized over the past months that the life she'd thought she wanted in Chicago, with its emphasis on status and appearances, had never truly suited her. This, standing next to a good man who worked hard and treated her as an equal, felt more right than anything ever had. Ethan took her hand, his green eyes serious. "Kiera, I know we haven't known each other long, just 4 months, but I feel like I've known you my whole life. You're the smartest, bravest, most capable woman I've ever met, and I wake up every day grateful that your wagon wheel broke when it did. I love you, and I want to build a life with you if you'll have me." He dropped to one knee, pulling a simple gold band from his pocket. "Will you marry me?" Kiera's vision blurred with tears, but they were happy ones. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, of course, yes." The ring fit perfectly, and Ethan stood, pulling her into his arms and kissing her with a tenderness that made her heart ache in the best possible way. They stood there on the porch as the sky deepened from orange to purple to star-studded black, holding each other and talking about their future. They were married in January of 1884, in a simple ceremony at the Lordsburg church with Martha, Ethan's sisters who traveled from Texas, and what seemed like half the town in attendance. Kiera wore a dress she and Martha had made together, simple but beautiful, and Ethan looked at her as though she was the most precious thing in the world. The first year of marriage had its challenges as they learned to merge their lives. Kiera continued working at the shop 3 days a week, riding out to the ranch the other days and managing the ranch accounts from there. Ethan proved to be as supportive as she'd hoped, never once suggesting she should give up her work to focus solely on being a wife. In return, Kiera learned ranching, throwing herself into understanding cattle and horses with the same dedication she'd applied to the dress shop. She could ride well by spring, could help with branding by summer, and by fall, Ethan was calling her his full partner in every sense of the word. Their first child, a son they named Samuel, was born in December of 1884, 2 weeks before their first anniversary. He was healthy and strong, with Ethan's green eyes and Kiera's dark hair, and both parents fell instantly, completely in love. Kiera continued working at the shop after Samuel's birth, though she reduced her hours, and Martha was more than happy to dote on her great-nephew while Kiera was at work. The arrangement worked beautifully, giving Kiera the balance she needed between business and motherhood. 2 years later, a daughter named Rose joined their family, then another son, Henry, 18 months after that. The ranch house Ethan had built expanded with each child, rooms added one by one as the family grew. What had started as a simple 3-room structure became a sprawling, comfortable home filled with laughter and love. The cattle operation grew too. With Kiera's business acumen and Ethan's skill as a rancher, they expanded from 50 head to 200, added horses as Ethan had hoped, and became one of the most successful ranches in the area. They hired hands to help, built a second barn, and purchased an additional 80 acres when the neighboring property came up for sale. The dress shop thrived as well. Martha trained the seamstresses Kiera had hired, and by the early 1890s, they had 4 women working full-time and a customer base that stretched across 3 counties. When Martha's rheumatism made sewing difficult, she transitioned to managing the business side with Kiera, and they hired a master seamstress to oversee the actual production. Through it all, Kiera and Ethan's love deepened and matured. They had their disagreements, of course, moments of frustration and misunderstanding, but they'd both learned early that talking through problems was better than letting them fester. They made time for each other despite the demands of the ranch and the children, stealing moments alone whenever possible. On their 10th anniversary, Ethan surprised Kiera with a trip to Santa Fe, arranging for Martha and the ranch hands to watch the children for a week. They stayed in a real hotel, ate in restaurants, and walked through the plaza holding hands like courting youngsters. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset from the hotel balcony, Ethan pulled Kiera close. "You ever regret it?" he asked. "Staying here, marrying me, building this life instead of something else?" Kiera looked at him, at his weathered face that had only grown more handsome to her over the years, at the green eyes that still made her heart skip. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment. You saved me that day on the trail, Ethan, but not just from a broken wagon. You saved me from a life that would have been half-lived, measured, and cautious and small. You taught me that I could be brave, that I could build something meaningful. You're my home." Ethan's eyes were suspiciously bright. "You saved me too," he said quietly. "I was just going through the motions before I met you, existing but not really living. You brought color and joy and purpose to everything. I love you more now than I did the day we married, and I'll love you more tomorrow than I do today." They kissed as the sun set over Santa Fe, and Kiera felt a deep, abiding contentment. This was what she'd been searching for without knowing it, this partnership, this love, this life they'd built together from nothing but determination and hope. The children grew. Samuel proved to have his father's way with animals and took to ranching naturally, already talking about expanding the operation when he was old enough. Rose had her mother's head for business and announced at age 8 that she intended to run the dress shop someday. Henry, the baby and unexpected comedian of the family, kept everyone laughing with his antics and endless questions. Martha lived to see all 3 children into their teens, passing away peacefully in her sleep in the summer of 1900 at the age of 70. Her death hit Kiera hard, but she took comfort in knowing her aunt had lived a full life and had been surrounded by love until the very end. The dress shop continued under Kiera's management, with Rose apprenticing in earnest once she turned 16. More children joined the family over the years. Another daughter, Martha, named for Kiera's beloved aunt, was born when Kiera was 38, a surprise that delighted the whole family. She was followed 2 years later by twin boys, James and Joseph, who immediately doubled the chaos and joy in the household. Ethan took to fatherhood with the same steady competence he brought to everything else. He was patient with the children, firm when necessary but always fair, and he made sure each one knew they were loved unconditionally. He taught the boys to ride and rope, helped Rose with her arithmetic, and could be found reading bedtime stories to little Martha every night without fail. As the new century progressed, the West changed around them. The railroad brought more people, more commerce, more modernization. Automobiles appeared on the streets of Lordsburg. Electricity came to town, and the rough frontier settlement grew into a proper city. Through all the changes, the ranch remained a constant, a piece of the Old West preserved through hard work and dedication. Kiera and Ethan adapted to the changes while maintaining what they valued most. They installed electricity in the ranch house, bought a telephone to keep in better touch with the children when they started leaving for school and jobs, and even purchased an automobile, though Ethan swore he'd never trust it as much as a good horse. Samuel married in 1905, bringing a lovely young woman named Elizabeth to the family. They settled on a piece of the ranch Ethan deeded to them, building their own house and starting their own herd. Rose took over the dress shop completely when she turned 25, modernizing the business with mail-order catalogs and newspaper advertisements that brought customers from as far away as El Paso. Henry decided ranching wasn't for him and shocked everyone by announcing he wanted to be a lawyer. He moved to Albuquerque for school, and while Ethan was initially disappointed, he came to respect his son's choice and supported him fully. Henry graduated at the top of his class and opened a practice helping homesteaders and small ranchers with legal issues. The younger children followed their own paths too. Martha became a teacher, the twins went into business together running a freight company, and all of them built lives that made their parents proud. Through everything, Kiera and Ethan remained partners in the truest sense. They worked side by side on the ranch well into their 60s, though they gradually handed over more responsibilities to Samuel and his sons. They traveled some, visiting Henry in Albuquerque, and taking a memorable trip to San Francisco for their 40th anniversary. But mostly, they were content with the life they'd built in New Mexico, with the ranch that had grown from Ethan's dream into a family legacy, with the children and grandchildren who filled their house with noise and laughter. On a warm evening in July of 1924, 40 years almost to the day after that broken wagon wheel had brought them together, Kiera and Ethan sat on their porch watching the sunset. Their hair was white now, their faces lined with age, but their hands were still clasped together the same way they'd been since that first dinner in Lordsburg. "You remember," Kiera said, "that day when you found me crying over my broken wagon?" Ethan smiled, the expression creating familiar creases around his eyes. "Best day of my life, though I didn't know it then. You were so determined to be brave, even though you were terrified." "I was," Kiera admitted. "I thought my life was ending, that everything I'd hoped for was lost. I couldn't see that it was really just beginning." "Neither could I," Ethan said. "I was just planning to fix your wheel and send you on your way. Didn't expect to fall in love with you before I'd even fit the first spoke." Kiera laughed, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Liar. You didn't fall in love with me until at least the second spoke." "You might be right," Ethan agreed, his arm coming around her shoulders. "But somewhere in those 2 days, between the sanding and the fitting and the talking, I knew I couldn't let you just drive away. I knew I had to at least try to be part of your life. I'm glad you asked to journey with me, Kiera said softly. Not just to Lordsburg that day, but through all of this. Through 40 years of joy and sorrow, triumph and hardship, I couldn't have asked for a better companion. It's not over yet, Ethan pointed out. We've got years ahead of us still. I plan to sit on this porch with you when we're 90, watching our great-grandchildren run around the yard. That sounds perfect, Kiera said and meant it. They sat in comfortable silence as the sky darkened and the stars emerged, the same stars they'd watched together on that first night when Ethan had fixed her wheel and everything had changed. The ranch was quiet around them, the cattle settled for the night, the horses drowsing in the barn. Somewhere in the house, they could hear their youngest grandson practicing his piano lesson, the notes drifting through the open windows. This was what they'd built together, Kiera thought. Not just the ranch or the business or the house, but a life. A real, full, beautiful life that had started with a broken wheel, and a kind stranger who'd stopped to help. They'd taken that chance meeting and transformed it into something lasting, something that would continue long after they were gone through the children and grandchildren who carried their legacy forward. Ethan squeezed her hand and she squeezed back, a silent conversation they'd perfected over 40 years of marriage. I love you. I'm here. We're together. Everything else was just details. The years continued to pass with the gentle rhythm of ranch life. Samuel took over the cattle operation entirely, proving himself more than capable of not just maintaining what his parents had built, but expanding it. He bought more land, introduced new breeding stock, and by the late 1920s, the Xavier Ranch was one of the largest and most respected in southern New Mexico. Rose's dress shop evolved with the times, transitioning from practical frontier wear to more modern fashions while maintaining the commitment to quality and affordability that Martha and Kiera had established. She trained her own daughter in the business, and together they opened a second location in Las Cruces. Ethan and Kiera settled into a comfortable semi-retirement, still active in running the ranch, but no longer bearing the full weight of it. They spent their mornings riding the property together, checking on cattle and horses, enjoying the land they'd worked so hard to cultivate. Afternoons were for grandchildren, who descended on the ranch house in noisy, joyful packs, demanding stories and cookies and the kind of unconditional love that grandparents specialized in providing. Ethan taught the grandsons to rope and ride just as he'd taught his own children, patient and encouraging even when they fumbled. Kiera helped the granddaughters with their schoolwork and their dreams, encouraging them to think big and reach high the way Martha had once encouraged her. On their 50th anniversary in 1934, the entire family gathered at the ranch for a celebration that lasted 3 days. All 6 children came with their spouses and children, filling the house and spilling out into tents pitched around the property. There was music and dancing, feasting and laughter, and Kiera looked around at the family they'd created and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. During the party, Samuel stood to make a speech. My parents started with nothing but determination and love, he said, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. Dad had a small ranch and big dreams. Mom had lost everything and was trying to start over. They met by chance on a dusty trail and they built this. He gestured expansively at the ranch, the family, the life surrounding them. They taught us that hard work matters, that integrity matters, that family matters most of all. Everything I am, everything we all are, comes from their example. So let's raise a glass to Ethan and Kiera Xavier, the best parents, grandparents, and people I know. The toast was drunk amid cheers and tears, and Kiera saw that Ethan's eyes were wet. He'd never been comfortable with praise, always preferred to let his actions speak for themselves, but she could see how moved he was by their son's words. That night, after the party had quieted and most of the family was asleep, Kiera and Ethan slipped away to their favorite spot on the porch. The house was full of the soft sounds of sleeping children and grandchildren, and the night was clear and cool. 50 years, Ethan said, shaking his head in wonder. Feels like 5 and 500 all at once. I know what you mean, Kiera replied. Sometimes I still feel like that frightened girl with the broken wagon, and then I look at our grandchildren and realize how much time has really passed. You're not that frightened girl anymore, Ethan said. Haven't been for a long time. You're strong now, confident. You know who you are and what you're worth. You helped me become that person, Kiera pointed out. You believed in me before I believed in myself. We helped each other, Ethan corrected gently. That's what partners do. They rocked slowly in their chairs, hands clasped between them, comfortable in the silence and each other's presence. The years had been kind to them in many ways and hard in others. They'd lost friends and family, weathered droughts and economic downturns, survived illnesses and injuries. But they'd faced it all together, and that had made all the difference. As the 1930s progressed, the country struggled with economic depression, but the ranch remained relatively stable. The years of careful management and diversification paid off, allowing them to not just survive, but help others who were less fortunate. Ethan hired men who needed work even when he didn't strictly need the help, and Kiera organized food drives through the church, using ranch resources to feed families who were struggling. Their generosity was remembered and appreciated, building goodwill that would serve the family well for generations. The Xavier name became synonymous with fairness and compassion, and both Ethan and Kiera took pride in that legacy. The summer of 1939 brought their 60th wedding anniversary and another massive family celebration. By then, there were 18 grandchildren and 4 great-grandchildren, with more on the way. The ranch house, which had seemed so spacious when they first expanded it, was bursting at the seams. Ethan was 79 years old that summer, still strong but moving more slowly, his old leg injury bothering him more as the years accumulated. Kiera was 77, her mind still sharp even as her body grew frailer. They joked that between them, they made one fully functional person, his strength supplementing her endurance, her memory compensating for his increasing forgetfulness. 60 years, Ethan mused on the morning of their anniversary. You've put up with me for 60 years. You deserve a medal. I'd settle for another 60, Kiera replied, and though they both knew that was unlikely, they smiled at the thought. The celebration was smaller than the 50th anniversary, but no less meaningful. The family gathered, now spanning 4 generations, all of them connected by the love story that had started with a broken wagon wheel. Rose had found a photograph from their wedding day, and Kiera was startled to see how young they'd looked, how full of hope and possibility. We did all right, didn't we? Ethan asked, studying the photograph over her shoulder. We did better than all right, Kiera said firmly. We did magnificently. World War II brought its own challenges. Henry, though too old to serve himself, saw his 2 oldest sons enlist. The worry aged both Kiera and Ethan, and they spent many sleepless nights praying for the boys' safe return. Both came home eventually, changed but alive, and the family celebrated their return with the kind of profound gratitude that only comes from facing the possibility of loss. The post-war years brought prosperity and change. The ranch modernized further, introducing new equipment and techniques that made the work easier if less romantic. The dress shop closed in 1947, as ready-made clothing became more common, but Rose transitioned smoothly into running a successful dry goods store instead. Through all the changes, Ethan and Kiera remained each other's constant. They moved more slowly now. Their daily rides shortened to gentle walks, but they still greeted each morning together and ended each evening on their porch, watching the sunset over land they'd loved and worked for more than 6 decades. Ethan passed away in his sleep in the spring of 1950, just 2 months before what would have been their 66th anniversary. He was 89 years old, and Kiera was beside him when it happened, holding his hand as she'd held it for all those years. His last words were her name, spoken with all the love and devotion that had characterized their marriage. The loss devastated Kiera. For the first time in 66 years, she was alone, and the world felt impossibly empty without Ethan's steady presence beside her. The family rallied around her, never leaving her by herself, but she felt his absence in everything. The porch was too quiet without his soft commentary. The bed was too big without his warmth. Every sunset was bittersweet, beautiful but lonely. But Kiera was 88 years old, and she'd lived through enough loss to know that grief, while overwhelming, wouldn't destroy her. She had children who needed her, grandchildren who looked to her for wisdom, great-grandchildren who deserved to know their family history. So she endured, finding meaning in the life that continued around her. She lived another 3 years, remaining sharp and engaged until the very end. She spent her time telling stories to anyone who would listen, making sure the family knew where they came from and what they'd built together. She wanted them to understand that their prosperity and security hadn't come easily, that it had been earned through hard work, determination, and above all, love. On a warm July afternoon in 1953, 69 years after a broken wagon wheel had changed her life forever, Kiera sat on the porch of the ranch house surrounded by family. Samuel was there, now running the ranch with his own sons. Rose had come from Las Cruces with several of her grandchildren. Henry was visiting from Albuquerque, his legal career winding down as he approached retirement. They'd been talking about Ethan, sharing memories and laughter, when Kiera suddenly grew quiet. She was looking out over the land, over the cattle grazing in the distance and the horses running in the near pasture, and her expression was peaceful. "He's waiting for me," she said softly. "I can feel it, not today, but soon." Samuel started to protest, but Kiera raised her hand. "Don't fuss. I've had a long life, a good life, better than I ever could have imagined when I was a frightened girl with a broken wagon. I've loved and been loved. I've built something that will last. I'm ready." 2 weeks later, Kiera died peacefully in her sleep, just as Ethan had. She was 91 years old, and to the end, she'd maintained that meeting Ethan had been the best luck of her life. They buried her next to Ethan on a hill overlooking the ranch, beneath a cottonwood tree they'd planted together in their first year of marriage. The whole family came, 4 generations strong, to say goodbye to the woman who'd been the heart of their family for so long. The ranch continued under Samuel's management, then his sons, then his grandsons, each generation building on what came before. The dress shop building in Lordsburg still stood, converted now into apartments, but with a plaque on the wall commemorating Martha and Kiera's pioneering business. And on summer evenings, when the light turned golden and the air grew cool, family members still gathered on the old ranch house porch, rocking in chairs and telling stories. They told about Ethan, the cowboy who'd stopped to help a stranded woman. They told about Kiera, who turned disaster into opportunity and built a life of meaning. They told about a love story that started with a broken wagon wheel and lasted until death and beyond. Because that's what real love does. It builds. It endures. It creates something bigger than two people, something that ripples forward through time, shaping lives and futures in ways both small and profound. Kiera and Ethan had understood that, had lived it every day of their long marriage. They'd taken a chance encounter on a dusty trail and transformed it into a legacy that would last for generations, proving that sometimes the best journeys start with something broken and someone kind enough to help fix it.